Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Willis bringing you another episode of College Prep World History. This time we are entering a second World War. The war to end all wars, World War I, was not the war to end all wars. It is now World War II, and we're going to war again. This time it's going to be even worse, and the consequences are going to be even dire, based upon what we've seen from the age of uncertainty with the rise of fascism and Mussolini and Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin as well. And we're going to be covering some of that information here today, as well as mixing in some videos for you guys so you guys can see some of the different visual evidence we have. There's a lot of visual evidence during World War II that we can present to you guys, so it's going to be hard to pick and choose which ones to show you. But let's dive right into it. As you can see here in the first slide, the world at war again, and troops marching in, these German troops marching in. And so one of the things we're going to cover today is the invasion of Poland, which is the event that finally launches World War II. And so on our second slide, we have the rise of the Axis powers. So you guys are going to write down Axis powers, and those three powers are going to be Germany, Japan, and Italy. And we've covered those three specific countries in our Rise of Fascism section of this unit with Mussolini, Hitler, and Emperor Hirohito. Those three in 1936 are going to ally themselves together to eventually set the stage for 1939 when World War II will begin. And so one of the reasons why the Axis powers is called the Axis powers is because Hitler and Mussolini wanted the world to rotate around their two empires, their two countries, and so the Axis powers is the name for this particular alliance. On our next slide, we have how we kind of summarize a little bit how Germany has invaded the Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and now remember there was a Munich conference where British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain asked Adolf Hitler, what is it going to take for you to stop doing all this? And he says, well, give me the Sudetenland, and I mentioned that in one of my previous lectures. Well, you know darn well that Adolf Hitler is not going to stop. He demands that Poland become part of this growing German empire. He demands that Poland hand over the port city of Danzig, and this is the final straw. This is where Britain and France finally say, look, we can't continue to allow this guy to keep taking and taking and taking. And so when Germany invades Poland in September of 1939, Britain and France finally decide to resist, and Hitler makes a secret treaty, a secret pact with Stalin. If the Russians will invade Poland to the east, they can get half of the Polish lands, while Germany will get the western half. All right, so what do we need to know from this slide? What do we need to write down? Okay, we need to write down that the invasion of Poland, okay, the western half belongs to Hitler, the eastern half belongs to Stalin, all right, and France and Britain finally will resist the growing power of Adolf Hitler. All right, so now what I'm going to go ahead and show is a video here on the type of warfare that the Germans will use during World War II. They call it Blitzkrieg, or they call it lightning war. That's what Blitzkrieg means, lightning war. And it's this idea that there are waves being used in order to overwhelm the opponent. All right, so here's the video.
Germans are isolated. Strike on the sea. Strike on land, with tanks against horses, giant guns against sabers and rifles. Choose your time carefully, making sure the weather favors your machine. Strike at his city so that civilians will take to the roads, hampering the army, so that women and children will be killed in the streets or in hastily contrived shelters. Strike again. Repeat the dose, day after day, and then add a drop of treachery in the form of fifth columnists. This was Warsaw. Repeat for 18 days. One Nazi pincer cuts the Polish corridor. Another races to Krakow. From East Prussia, another army moves on Warsaw. Encircled, bombed, shelled, and stormed, Warsaw surrendered. Now, over the roof of the city, send your Luftwaffe sailing leisurely to photograph your handiwork. And on the ground, let the master race assemble the first of its slave populations, a stunned and shocked and hungry people whose sufferings do not end with the armistice, nor their resistance. Now, gloat.
See from the video that you just watched, it's pretty overwhelming the way that the Germans are able to use different types of technology, different waves of attacking their opponents, and because of these effective methods of conquering, the Germans, as you're going to see in World War II, are capable of conquering many of the lands surrounding them very, very quickly. So Hitler's power grows immensely in Europe at the beginning of World War II, mainly because the United States is not involved in the war, and then also it's hard for the British to mobilize their military quickly because of the location, because of the island. And the real strength for the British lies with their navy. And so when, as you can see on this slide, Blitzkrieg, when the Germans invade Poland, they carry 1.5 million soldiers into Polish territory along with their tanks, along with their bombers. They can attack from the sea by launching artillery into Poland. It's really no match for the Polish people. They're conquered rather quickly. Warsaw crumbles, they devastate it, they blow it to the ground. And as promised, Hitler takes the western half of Poland while Stalin takes the eastern half. And so this effective method of launching waves, whether it's planes, tanks, and people are the last thing, because those are the soldiers are the one resource that are hard to replace very quickly, you use troops last in this method of fighting. Use that technology that you have to your advantage in order to overwhelm your opponent. Now our next slide talks about the Soviets' role in this particular early part of World War II. And what Hitler's going to find out is that very quickly the Soviets are not as powerful as they make themselves out to be. And so he's going to see some of that evidence presented when Stalin attacks these different northeastern European, Scandinavian countries. And it's going to be rather difficult for the Soviet Union, these Russian troops, to be able to quickly conquer these people. And the one example would be in Finland. Now, Scandinavia, during this time, as we move throughout the remaining part of 1939 into the winter of 1940, it's going to be really difficult in this first 6 months for the Soviet troops to be able to conquer the people of Finland, even though they should be able to overwhelm them rather quickly because of the immense magnitude of and the enormity of having way more soldiers, the Soviets having way more soldiers than the Finnish troops. But they're not able to conquer them quickly. As a matter of fact, the Finnish troops make the Soviets look rather foolish, even though the Soviets will ultimately end up winning this battle between the Finns and the Soviets. And you're going to see some of that in our next video that we're going to show you, which is really unique. You're going to see Finnish soldiers using the climate to their advantage. They're going to be skiing around using a machine gun, firing the machine gun at the Soviets. And it's really going to make the Soviets look very foolish when it comes to this agreement that was made between Stalin and Hitler. And so basically from this slide, what you want to know is that the Soviets and Stalin are able to conquer Poland, they're able to conquer Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, but it's Finland that gives the Soviets trouble. And so it's not until the latter half of 1940 that Stalin is able to conquer Finland. And so the lesson here on this slide is that Hitler knows that he is not going to have a strong ally in Joseph Stalin. And they're not really allies anyway. They sign a treaty of non-aggression. He knows that this is not going to be a lasting agreement between the two men. And so let's go ahead and dive into the next video, which is going to show the combat between the Finns and the Soviets.
In 1939, the newly purged Red Army invaded Finland. The Soviets had a more than 2-to-1 advantage over the Finns, and the Germans took careful notice of what happened next.
Я увидел там жуткую картину. Это было такое впечатление, что кто-то как будто нарочно бросил 22 тысячи людей замерзать. Противника никакого видно не было нигде. Как будто сам лес стрелял. Они мелкими группами по 10-15 человек в маск-халатах подкрадывались к этим кострам, делали короткие залпы из автоматов и винтовок и тут же убегали. Из 4000 вышло только 500 человек. Все остальные были убиты, ранены или обморожены. Конечно, это немцам открыло глаза на слабость советской армии, потому что тут очень неудачная была со стороны советской армии операция, очень неудачная. Это была трагедия, по сути.
See from that video, the Soviets were not equipped to fight, which is surprising because their climate is similar to that of Finland, but they were not equipped to fight in these conditions. And so it's going to lead to this disintegration of the relationship between the Soviets and the Germans. Now, in response to that, on the Western front, or the western side of this battle or this war between the Axis powers and future Allied powers, we have what we call the phony war, and then we have this on this slide. The phony war consists of two lines. Okay, so you're going to need to write down both lines. The first is the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line are a system of fortifications similar to the place where in World War I we had trench warfare. Instead of trenches, they built forts along this French and German border, and the British and French troops along that border are going to wait for the Germans to attack because they know it's coming. So they set up defense system like in World War I in order to be able to meet the Germans when they come. Well, what happens on the other side is that the Germans in 1940 build what we call the Siegfried Line. So you need to know the Maginot Line and the Siegfried Line. These are defensive fortifications for both sides of the war. So the Maginot Line is the French and British line. The Siegfried Line is the German line. And why they call this the phony war is because there actually will be no fighting initially here on this side. What happens is Hitler uses the Siegfried Line as a decoy because his true intent is to actually attack Denmark and Norway, and he does that on April 9th, 1940. So he's going to capture the Danish coast, and as you can see here, the Germans are getting a lot of different port cities here, attacking the different port cities. They're going to do that eventually here when we talk about Dunkirk in France. They're going to attack all these port cities and take control of these port cities all along the European northern coast. And they're doing this because they want to set up a launching point to attack Britain. And they're going to be very, very successful in being able to take over these port cities and set up a base of operations to attack Great Britain. Because they know in order to win this war, in order to win the Second World War, they're going to have to defeat the British. They're going to have to defeat all the Allies and leave Great Britain by themselves in order to be able to succeed in this war. And so Denmark and all these different smaller nations are going to fall very quickly. Poland falls very quickly. Really the ones that the Soviets attack are the ones that take a little bit longer, right? But this is a very, very successful beginning for Adolf Hitler, the Nazis, and the Germans. They are very successful in setting up a base of operations westward into Europe and being able to really pin the French down by themselves in France and hopefully conquer those French people to set the stage for an attack, an invasion of Great Britain through this. All right, so we're going to go ahead and end the lecture today with one more video on the Maginot Line, and you're going to see these systems of fortifications set up, so you guys can get an idea of what it was like and how it might be different than when in World War I, where they had bunkers and they had these trenches, and now we're going to have these fortifications, these line of fortifications set up along the Western Front in World War II. So at the conclusion of the video, that will be the end of this presentation for College Prep World History. You guys, will see you next time.
The French knew that ultimately the Rhineland would be reoccupied by Germany if the Allies removed themselves from this buffer zone. If the Germans reoccupied the Rhineland, France would be vulnerable. At least along its borders with Switzerland and Italy, the Alps were a formidable barrier. In the north, Belgium was an ally, and in the east, the Rhine River and Vosges Mountains provided some protection. But the Rhineland was perceived as an open door, and the French endeavored to close it by undertaking a massive program of fortification construction along the Franco-German border.
In the 1920s, when they made the decision to go ahead and build a system of fortifications, the war minister set up several commissions. And about 1927, they set up something known as the CORF, which in English refers to a Commission for the Organization of Fortified Fronts. And what the Corps did was prepare the designs that were going to be used on all the fortifications.
Korff drew up the plans in the late 1920s, but the push to fund the construction of the defenses began with Paul Painlevé, who was then Minister of War. Painlevé was succeeded by a former war hero named André Maginot. But Maginot had nothing to do with the design of the barrier.
But where his real work lay was in actually getting the money, the first main slice of money. He used all his influence to push it through.
Maginot was a consummate politician.
He would appeal to the right, and he would appeal to French patriotism, and France as a country full of national pride and grandeur is the word, that France is a world power and must remain so. And then he would turn to the left and say, hey, this is going to be a great way to solve our unemployment problem, right? We'll be able to put a lot of people to work on this Maginot Line. So he would appeal to both the left and the right.
Shortly after having initially secured nearly 3 million francs for the defenses, tall, solitary André Maginot died.
He actually was at a New Year's banquet and got food poisoning because of oysters that he had eaten, and so he ended up dying. So that ended his tenure as Minister of War. But that period between 1929 and 1932 was really critical because he was the one who suggested that there was a sense of urgency.
3 years later, a newspaper referred to the eastern defenses as the Maginot Line, and the name stuck. André Maginot had come from Alsace, so it was not surprising that he supported the construction of the barrier to defend that region. But André Maginot died thinking the barrier would be one thing. After his death, it would become something much different, at least in the minds of the French. Korff began construction in 1929, after the funds had been raised.
The whole objective of the Maginot Line was to delay a German attack into France. Not to stop the Germans from attacking, but to make it very difficult for the Germans to attack, and to be able to use this defensive position as something behind which they could mobilize a field army and defend themselves and be prepared to launch counterattacks. It basically was intended to offset the population difference between France and Germany.
But the purpose of the line would slowly shift.
As the decade moved on, and as the pressure for reducing military service increased, and when it became clear that, one, the Rhineland was going to be evacuated, and probably ahead of schedule, two,